be our textbook for the first weeks of the course. As you can see, it deals with nationalism. Before we begin our serious study of it, I'd like to run through it quickly with you. That way we'll know where we're heading, which is more than I can say for our football team last Saturday. But first, let's find out what nationalism is. Mr. Allen.
Here, sir.
Mr. Allen, tell the class what nationalism is.
Stormtroopers, I guess, and things like that.
Do you have anything to add, Mr. Smith?
Isn't it?
Since 1946, every new nation of Southeast Asia has annually celebrated its Day of Independence as a nation. Our struggle for independence is of the past, taken for granted. Theirs, a most recent achievement defended. Historically speaking, they are newborn. The Philippines gained independence in 1946. India and Pakistan in 1947. Burma and Ceylon in 1948. Indonesia in 1954. And Malaya in 1957. The story behind Southeast Asian independence is the story of nationalism. What exactly is nationalism? Why is it so important? Nationalism is the feeling and belief by a people living within a certain territory that they ought to be unified into an independent nation. Basically, it is the idea of a homeland. It is the sense of belonging together, of sharing things in common. Things like customs, festivals, language, and in some cases, religion. Not all these things have to be shared. The Indonesians, for example, speak 40 different dialects. But the binding force of some common elements is essential for the growth of nationhood. And the psychological feeling of a need to belong has been a deep and powerful force in human affairs. During the last 4 centuries, the riches of Southeast Asia attracted the Europeans. They came to trade, they stayed to conquer. Because of Europe's industrial supremacy and military might, they took over this agricultural area and exploited its resources. In the 19th century, European control was widely extended. This control of a land and its people was called colonialism. The peoples of the Southeast Asian colonies became second-class citizens of large empires. As one of the great storehouses of natural resources, Southeast Asia was a prize worth having. The colonizing countries were astute, for Southeast Asia proved within 100 years to be the producer of 5/6 of the world's natural rubber. More than half the world's supply of tin is produced here, and a considerable amount of other ores. The region is also the main supplier of kapok, used in pillows and life preservers. But most important, it produces rice. This is the bread, the staple of Asian life. Burma, Thailand, Indonesia all produce this vital staple in abundance. At present, the region supplies fully 60% of all the rice production in the world. Nearly as important as its natural wealth is Southeast Asia's key strategic position astride the main lines of communication between Europe and the Far East. These were tempting economic and military rewards which led the colonial powers to seek control over these countries. In Burma, for example, Britain abolished the monarchy and put an English viceroy in charge. But as the deposed Burmese monarch had been both the head of government and the leader of the national Buddhist religion, this led to drastic social changes. For example, the British imported their own legal system, but the British laws were not understood by the Burmese and had disastrous consequences. Under the old laws, the peasants could never have their land taken from them. Now, under the English law, if they didn't repay a loan, they lost their land. The colonial administration restricted native rights, ran the affairs of the colony to the advantage of the foreign elite, and left most of the natives at a low economic level. The colonizers defended their actions by pointing to developments in the colonies of natural resources and export trade, improvements in communication and transportation, advances in health and sanitation, the establishment of business and industries, and the creation of modern cities. The colonial powers brought to Southeast Asia their cars, their goods, and their money. They also brought better education and more democratic ideas. The Asian people began to think in the newer ways. Some were inspired by the democratic ideals of Jefferson and Lincoln, and they began to publish their own ideas and to demand self-government for their own countries. During World War II, the Southeast Asians learned to become soldiers to fight the invading Japanese. By 1945, when Japan was defeated, the natives, now armed with weapons and democratic ideas, were determined to resist the imposition of any outside control by force. The colonial powers underestimated the depth of these new feelings of nationalism. In Burma, the British Army returned, but was kept under constant alert by the attacks of the Burmese nationalists. After 2 years of struggle, the British accepted the inevitable and granted Burma independence. In Indonesia, after World War II, the Dutch also tried to regain their control. Rioting broke out across the country when the resistance of 80 million Indonesians was united by the native army. The Dutch were finally forced to concede Indonesia its independence. Indonesia remains an undeveloped agricultural country. Her food supplies will have to be increased, technical and administrative personnel trained, and a better standard of living guaranteed before political stability is assured. In French Indochina during World War II, the local communists took the lead in the national resistance to the Japanese invaders and so gained the confidence of the people. After the war, they continued their armed insurrections against the returning French colonizers. The communist publications presented their movement as being progressive. They also presented pictures of the rapid improvement of living conditions under communism and preached freedom from the Western imperialists. To people as poor as are the Asiatic masses, such a doctrine offers the hope of immediate relief. By 1954, after 7 years of guerrilla warfare, the French were forced to accept partition of their colony. The North now became the separate state of Viet Minh, sometimes called North Vietnam and controlled by the communists. The South, Vietnam, became an independent republic. Laos became an independent kingdom, as did Cambodia. The Republic of Vietnam was governed by strong leaders who aimed eventually to establish democratic institutions. The vast majority of the southern Vietnamese people had not previously participated in democratic self-government, neither as a part of colonial France nor under Japanese occupation. The Vietnamese people had to be instructed in the new democratic ways. In all Southeast Asia, after World War II and the eviction of the Japanese, it was only in Malaya that a colonial power was able to reassert a temporary hold. The reason that the British were welcomed back to Malaya was that the three racial groups living there mistrusted each other. The Malays, the Chinese, and the Indians were suspicious of what each other's power might be in the new independent nation. Eventually, a constitution acceptable to all three groups was agreed upon. In 1957, Britain fulfilled her promise of giving Malaya its independence. The people went to the polls for the first time. The Philippines have their allegiance to the West through the United States, which acquired them in 1898. They gained their independence in 1946. The policy of the American government has always been to educate the people for citizenship in a democratic country. For this reason, when the Philippine voters first went to the voting booth, they were somewhat better prepared for their civic responsibility than those in other countries. But even here, where there has never been an accepted colonialism, while a minority of workers are enjoying the improved standards of living, a great mass of laborers have as yet a bare subsistence. Thailand, formerly Siam, has had a more fortunate history. It is the only Southeast Asian country never subjected to Western rule. Until 1932, Thailand was an absolute monarchy. Then it became a constitutional monarchy controlled by wealthy and powerful merchants. In World War II, it sided with Japan, but the war brought little damage to Thailand, and as it has escaped the resentments and frustrations of colonialism, it is comparatively prosperous and has little social unrest. However, a large Chinese minority does present a potential source of trouble because it remains loyal to China. In 1947, Muslim Pakistan split from Hindu India when both countries received their independence from Great Britain. Many of Pakistan's leaders, like its founder Jinnah, had been educated in England. They favored the democratic system, and as a result, Pakistan retained democratic institutions developed under colonialism. Boundary disputes between Pakistan and India are a constant source of friction. These are aggravated by their religious differences. India, with its 450 million people, is the largest, most populous nation of Southeast Asia. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, one of its founders, was also educated in England and was well versed in Western ideas. Since World War II, India has played a definite role in international affairs. Her foreign policy has been one of peaceful coexistence between all nations, communist and democratic alike. India also encourages conferences among the young Asian and African countries for mutual objectives. In 1948, after 150 years of British rule, the island of Ceylon was given independence and dominion status in the British Commonwealth. Although now independent, demonstrations show that considerable anti-British feeling remained. This is because the English owned most of the tea plantations, and tea is the main export of Ceylon. National sentiment has induced the Ceylonese government to declare that it will nationalize these English-owned tea plantations without compensation. But when these new independent Southeast Asian nations suddenly found themselves in the United Nations, they had automatically to also concern themselves with their position on world affairs. There were three courses of foreign policy open to them: pro-democracy, pro-Soviet, and non-committed or neutral. There were those who took each position. In meetings with the pro-democratic countries, the United States found herself in an unfortunate dilemma. She wished sincerely to help the independence of the Southeast Asian peoples, but she was also bound to her Western allies, who wished to retain their colonial interests. Soviet Russia immediately aligned herself with the newly created Southeast Asian nations. Her propaganda was clear-cut and effective: peaceful coexistence. She pretended to be for national independence and against foreign domination. The leaders and educated peoples of Southeast Asia were not all misled by Russian overtures. While maneuvering as best they could to serve their own interests, they had no intention of substituting one imperialism for another. Nevertheless, all the new governments of Southeast Asia are subject to strong political pressures, both from the United States of America and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union sets up local Communist Party headquarters from which to propagandize its line. They tune their propaganda to the wavelength of their listeners, and they encourage local groups to oppose their own governments throughout their countries. They set up showrooms from which to display their goods. Every Russian machine which is sold in Southeast Asia is an extra tie with the Russian economy, as all machines need their manufacturer's replacement and spare parts. But above all, the Russian communists send food. They are well aware that high-sounding phrases about democracy mean less than a mouthful to a starving man, and that acts, not just words, must overcome the suspicions of their own colonizing intentions. America and the West fight the Soviet propaganda with educational programs of their own, and also offer practical help in the form of food, machinery, and capital. Which side has the greatest influence on the development of the Southeast Asian nations must definitely affect the immediate history of the whole world. The Southeast Asian leaders, although grateful for help, are aware of their importance and bargain shrewdly to obtain aid without political entanglement. To stop communist infiltration, many of the Southeast Asian nations have also banded together to form the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, commonly known as SEATO. SEATO arranged to promote economic progress and work out mutual problems of aid and defense on a joint basis. In effect, then, Southeast Asia is in a revolt against a long heritage of incredible poverty, of obsolete economic, political, and social institutions, and of Western domination. These new nations are trying in a few short years to catch up with decades of Western history and industrialization. By discarding their colonial past, the Western nations can gain the confidence of their Southeast Asian neighbors and offer them not just material help, important as this is, but also an example of democratic freedom, the common road which the people of all nations ultimately hope to travel.